Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through how I built this 10x6 deck. Let's get started. Alright guys, so what I'm doing here is just making some marks for where my ledger board is going to go. I'm then going to transfer these marks down to the ground, and I'm going to drive rebar into the ground and use some string to create a layout for where my posts are going to go. After I've got my string outline done, I then take my tubes and put them in place and then paint a line around them so I know where I need to dig my holes. And I was going to use an auger for this project, but I didn't have enough room on my truck with all the materials that I had, so I just started hand digging. After I got my holes dug, I put my tubes in place and then cut them to length, and then it was time for concrete. With both of my tubes in place, I went ahead and started mixing my concrete. Each tube was 24 inches in the ground and about 4 or 5 inches above grade. So to fill each one, it took approximately 4 bags of concrete per tube. So what I'm doing here is repositioning my strings so that I can make sure my post bases will line up with each other. And after I get everything laid out how I want it, I'll drill a hole in each footer using a 5/8 SDS masonry bit, and I'll attach the post bases to the footers using an 8-inch Simpson concrete anchor. With my post base secured to the footers, I can now put my 6x6s in place. To do so, I set them in the post base and temporarily secured them using two 3-inch screws. I then used some 2x4s attached to stakes in the ground to get the posts level. And once the posts were level, I fully secured them to the post base using 3-inch galvanized nails. Next, I installed my flashing. For this project, I used 9-inch roll flashing. I installed 2 rows behind where the ledger board was going to go and 2 rows behind where the joist next to the house would sit. Now, this flashing does have a sticky backing to it, but I popped in a few staples just to make sure it wouldn't go anywhere. With the flashing in place, I can now install my ledger board. I cut it to length and then tacked it in place with a few 3-inch screws. I then made sure I got it perfectly level before securing it with lag screws staggered every 16 inches apart. After this was done, I needed to install my beam. In order to see exactly where it needed to go, I temporarily installed one joist by toe screwing it to the ledger and clamping it to one of my posts. Once I got it completely level, I then marked the post directly beneath the joist, and this would show me where the top of my beam would sit. I then clamped a 2x10 to both of my posts, got it level, and made my marks. Next, I cut my posts to length, and then using a speed square, I marked the layout for my notches. After they were laid out, I used a circular saw and a reciprocating saw to cut out the notches for my beam. With the notches cut out, I could now construct and install my beam. For this beam, I used two 2x10s fastened together with 3-inch nails. I then secured the beam to the post using 6-inch lag screws. With the beam in place, I can now start hanging my joists. I screwed a scrap piece of material to the top ends of the joists so that way they would hold themselves in place while I toe screwed them in. Afterwards, I would go back and secure all of them with joist hangers. After all my joists were hung, I cut and installed my blocking. Blocking really helps sturdy everything up and it keeps your joists from trying to roll over as well. For this, I just used 3-inch framing nails, but you can also use screws if you want to. Next, I installed my ledger flashing, which really should have been installed before I hung my joist, but I just completely forgot about it. And installing it after the fact really isn't a big deal, but it just creates a little bit more work as you have to notch out the flashing around each of the joists so that way it sits flush. Next, I cut some 4x4s in half and started installing my rail post. Now, as you can see here, I'm putting a post in that doesn't really need to be there. This section of railing would only be about 6 foot long, so having a post in the middle isn't really necessary. However, it wasn't until later that I caught this mistake and eventually had to take up some deck boards so that I could remove the post. Now, it wasn't going to hurt anything to leave it, but it just didn't look right to me, so I took it out. With all my rail posts installed, it was time to start putting in my deck boards, and for this I just used 10 by 2.5-inch deck screws. And as you can see in the video, I ran into some boards that weren't perfectly straight and I had to find a way to close the gaps between the decking. And for this, I just screwed a scrap piece of 2x4 to the joist and pulled it away from the decking, and that closed up the majority of the gaps that I had. Now, as you can see here, my joists are hanging out quite a bit from where the end of the deck is going to be, and that was intentional. I wanted to make sure that when I got to the last deck board that I wasn't going to have to rip it down, so I left the joist long, and when I got close to the end, I marked where the last board was going to land, and then I cut my joist accordingly. After my joists were cut, I cut and installed my rim joist and fascia. The rim joist was 2x8 material just like the other joists were, and for the fascia I used 2x10 material. With the fascia finished, I can now start working on the steps. I began by getting a measurement from the top of the decking to the ground and dividing that number by my ideal rise, which was 7 inches. And after doing some calculations, I could determine exactly where my steps were going to land. Next, I placed a 2x4 on top of the decking and extended it to where my steps were projected to land. I then got the 2x4 level and measured to the ground again so that way I could determine exactly what my rise needed to be. Finally, because I was working on a slope, I dug the ground out and got it as level as I could, and I took another measurement just to make sure nothing had changed because of the digging that I had just done. And once all this was sorted out, I could lay out my stair stringers, cut them, and get them installed. Now, I know this wasn't an in-depth explanation of how to calculate and measure for stair stringers, but if that's something you guys would like to see me do a video on, please let me know in the comments below. What I'm doing here is essentially just laying out where my stair stringers will go. Now, because my fascia doesn't extend far enough down to give me something to screw my stair stringer hangers into, I made a nailing board out of 2x4 material and attached it to the fascia. This way I'll be able to fully secure my hangers into something solid before attaching my stringers. With my stringer hangers attached, I can now mark and cut my stringers. I just used a framing square and a set of stair gauges to mark my layout, and I used a circular saw and a jigsaw to make my cuts. After I cut my first one, I set it in place to make sure it was right, and I then used it as a template on the other two 2x12s that I was using. Now that my stringers were done, I began working on my risers. Now typically when I do this, I like to use 1x8 material, but it was out of stock everywhere I checked, so I had to use deck boards instead. And because a deck board is only 5.5 inches wide and these risers ended up being around 6.5 inches tall, I had to use an additional 1-inch strip with the 5.5 inch board to get the height that I needed. After all my risers were done, I cut some more 4x4s and began installing the posts for my stair rails. Now you'll see me installing these on the inside of the stringers, and I didn't notch them, and that was a mistake because they didn't end up lining up with the posts at the top of the stairs. So off camera, I had to take the posts back out, notch them, and then reinstall them. So just make sure that when you install your stair rail posts, they actually line up with the posts you installed at the top of the steps. Now that the posts were done, I could install my treads, so I just cut a bunch of deck boards to length and then installed them using 10 by 2.5 inch deck screws, just like I did for the decking. Once the stairs were finished, I started working on the rails. I began by cutting and installing the bottom rails, which I sat up on some scrap 2x4s to make sure that I had consistent spacing before toe screwing them in place. For the top rails, I just used some clamps to hold them in position while I got them screwed down. For the top stair rails, I measured up about 37 inches and made a mark on all the posts. I then clamped a 2x4 to the post, making sure it lined up with my marks. With the 2x4 in position, I marked the back side of it where it met the post, which would give me the exact layout for how it needed to be cut. I then cut the 2x4s and screwed them into the post, and for the bottom stair rails, I used the exact same process. With the rails installed, I can now cut the tops of the post. I just use a circular saw to make the cuts and then clean them up a little bit with the oscillating tool. I left the posts at the bottom of the stairs long because I'm going to be installing a decorative cap on those. Now that the rails were done, I started cutting my balusters. Now, for me personally, I like to cut the angle off the top and leave the angle on the bottom. I just think that it makes for a cleaner look. Now, as far as installation goes, I just nailed these in place with 2-inch framing nails, and I used a spacing jig that I made to make sure that the spacing between the balusters was consistent. Now, as you can see here, the balusters are cut a little different for the stairs. I like doing it this way because I think it looks nicer than the standard way that they're usually installed. Now, to achieve this look, all you have to do is set the miter angle and the bevel to the same angle of the stair rails, which in this case happen to be 35 degrees. With the balusters done, it was time to install the rail caps and the decorative post caps I mentioned earlier. For the rail caps, I just screwed those in using 3-inch deck screws, and I used some clamps along the way to help me keep everything flush and tight. The decorative caps for the stair posts have a sticky tab in them that's supposed to hold them in place, but after letting it set up for a bit, I just didn't trust that it was going to hold, so I added a bit of construction adhesive just to be safe. After this, I installed the handrail, which was really simple. It just consists of screwing some brackets into the top rail and then securing the handrail itself to the brackets using the screws that come with the kit. Next, I cut the ends of my deck boards to length. Now, I should have done this before I installed the balusters, so that way I wouldn't have had to do it from a ladder, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. To do this, I just measured out equal distance from both of my rail posts, snapped a line, and cut it with the circular saw as far as I could. And when I got close to the house, I just used the oscillating tool to finish it up. The last step of this build was to do a little bit of sanding. I sanded off all the pencil marks that I made and any other marks that stood out, as well as the edges of the rail caps and any other areas that looked like they needed to be smoothed out. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Also, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Until next time, take care and God bless.